Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the podcast yet again. And for those of you who are listening for the first time, welcome. So if you have a child at home or in your classroom who is very bright, but struggles with learning or some other aspect of their lives, this is the episode for you. My guest today is Dr. Nicole Tetreault. She's a neuroscientist, author, meditation teacher, and an internationally recognized speaker. Today, we're going to discuss some of the unique challenges that children identified as gifted or twice exceptional face. Listen in as we discuss how to parent with compassion, investigate your child's struggles, and nurture our children's gifts so they can thrive.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Dr. Tetreault, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to see you.
I'm so lucky to be here with you, Dr. Wilson.
You know, it's so interesting is that we met at Visions, the 2E conference that was at Bridges Academy pre-COVID, which seems so long ago. I think it's probably the last conference we were both speaking, and it seemed like that was almost the last conference I spoke at in person, because I haven't spoken at another conference in person in over a year. It's going on a year and a half.
Yeah. I mean, we have been sequestered.
We have been. So much has changed since that time. But I, when I started this podcast, I knew that I wanted to talk about giftedness. And because this is a podcast about learning differences, of course, I wanted to talk about 2E as well. And I'm so glad that you agreed to have a conversation with me, because I feel like you are the perfect person to discuss both giftedness and 2E. And so thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. I mean, how would you define 2E or twice exceptional for listeners who might be unfamiliar with the term?
Yeah. So, standardly when we look at textbooks and different things like that, there's the association of being identified as gifted, and, having a unique set of talents, and as well as the exceptionalities on the other spectrum of having a learning difference or a challenge. And, kind of the way that I really look at it, thinking about it being in the field of neuroscience, is really that it's the spectrum of our development. I think when we think about these different exceptionalities, we can get ourselves kind of locked into good, bad, rather than looking at even how a learning difference can offer kind of an area of unique processing. And when I think about it from the perspective of neuroscience in itself, I think about how the brain is really uniquely wired in each of, really in every individual, but in particular in individuals that tend to be twice exceptional, they're going to have different types of beginning with perceptions and receptivity, which then relay into different types of processing by their brain and nervous system, and then moving into more unconventional behaviors and reactions based on their brain wiring and processing.
Right. And so there's this asynchronous development is kind of what you're describing, where you can have this giftedness and these extraordinary talents, but at the same time have areas of relative weakness or significant weakness for some individuals.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head is that, or I always say those kind of things off. but
I say them too.
But really, it's that asynchrony is really at the heart of it, is that our brain, being a neuropsych yourself, you could see that individuals come in with totally different types of abilities and that the brain does not develop uniformly, and in some kids, their emotionality may develop later in life. Some kids, it's their executive functioning. Some of it's a combination of both. And that goes all the way into our adulthood as well. And so when we kind of open up to the idea that we're developing and growing beings, rather than meeting a certain standard, there's kind of a greater ability to see the spectrum of diversity and this asynchrony we see within this population.
Right. And even when we think about that gifted piece, it's not always about being book smart, right? It's about so much more than that. Can you talk a little bit about kind of when you think about the giftedness aspect of being twice exceptional, what that looks like? Because it can look so different in different kids.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And when we think about, standard giftedness, so much that we focus on is achievement and output of production related to either a special gift or talent and or related to academic success. That a gifted student is somebody who is going to be getting straight A's all the time. And when you think about that asynchrony, there could be 2, even 3 reasons why a gifted student may not excel academically. And it could be related to a learning difference. So say, for example, they're an avid reader, but they have challenges with written production. You could have a child where the other 2 options, where it kind of revolves around motivation, I think, where material could be boring, so they're unmotivated and not engaged. And then the other aspect where the information is too challenging, that we kind of push the child too far, where it's not meeting their proximal zone of ability. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings because we solely focus on this academic piece where there's this whole being developed with their social emotional context, their self-esteem that plays into it. And so we could kind of overemphasize and focus on trying to get this prodigy to produce at a level that is so impressive that we forget the development of the whole being.
Right. And then again, that speaks to kind of the different brain pathways and networks that are responsible for different aspects of who we are and how there are differences at the rates at which those are developing and they're connecting with other, brain cells in those areas. And one of the things you mentioned was about a parent who has a child and may say that child seems bored. And I often have parents who have kids who they either think are gifted or have been identified as gifted who say that, my kids are just not doing well in school and it seems that they're bored. And it almost seems that for some kids that could absolutely be true. But for some kids, it could be that 2E piece where they are gifted, but they also have attention issues. And that those attention issues might get missed because they think the child is just bored and not paying attention because it's not interesting to them.
That's a really great piece that you brought into this. And I love that you did because a lot when we think about really twice exceptional individuals, and the piece that you're honing in on is that different patterning and wiring. And a lot of kind of school focuses on the executive functioning network, which is getting something done on time in a manner that has to really do with skills related to attention and focus. And often these kids can be much more in a flow state where they're in their imagination, which is going to activate a different type of brain patterning and networking, which is more of your default mode network and your network related to meditative processes and daydreaming. And so one thing that you're really pointing to is kind of innate network kind of flow abilities that people tend to move toward. And if the attentional issues have to do with a kid who's highly imaginative, then we kind of need to rework the system and kind of think about that. And the other piece that, that we do know is that on a lot of these standard intelligence measures, the work of Colum and many others focus on this brain network called the PFIT model, which is the parietal frontal lobe model, where it encompasses like 28 different brain regions. And so when you're thinking about quick decision making and processing and learning and memory and regurgitating information, this network tends to be kind of the holy grail for it. And when we're thinking about asynchrony, if there's one or maybe two of those areas that are lacking of the 28 brain regions, you may not have a child who does that performance piece that you're expecting because they're gifted.
Right. And that is also that kind of piggybacks on this whole idea of IQ testing as a tool for identifying giftedness, because I often feel that so many kids who probably are gifted don't do well on those tests because of the reasons that you've described, either because of a slowed processing speed or, weaker connectivity in that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that impacts working memory. And so they get missed, and parents or teachers might say, oh, well, they're not gifted because they didn't score, the way that we would expect them to score on this particular test, when in fact we might be missing people by using those tools to identify giftedness.
Yeah. And I think you raise a really great piece that we struggle with our current identification system. And that's why I really adhere to the models that NAGC and the Renzulli model for giftedness, where it's really centered on competence, creativity, and hyperfocus, that ability to have that natural talent. But then what do you do with it on the aspect? Because that's the other piece. You could be very gifted, and if you're not doing anything to develop it, it could, other people could eventually surpass that, right? And then the standard IQ test, often, you being a neuropsych, you must see it constantly, where you have a child who scores 99th percentile, but then the minute you incorporate the timing with the processing speed, that would knock them out of having a high IQ. And I think, that processing speed is a conundrum that we're in, especially with that asynchrony. Because, we're not just developing cortical matter, right? That those neuronal connections, we're also developing the communication, the white matter across different brain regions. And so when we're missing that, or the coherence of the networks, a lot of studies show that really processing speed is reliant on cohesive communication between different brain regions, which is specific to the white matter patterning. And we know that during development, you're going to have more neuronal connections that are crisscrossed. And studies are just illuminating more and more that actually working memory is solely reliant on this connectivity and executive functioning.
Right. And when you talk about that working memory, you also mentioned executive functioning skills, and that's part of that same system, that in order to access a lot of higher level, tasks and engage in higher level problem solving, you have to, again, kind of navigate through your working memory system, hold information while you're doing other things, manipulate those things in order to get to the output that you mentioned. And that can be a challenge for so many kids, even when they are otherwise identified as gifted. Yeah,
exactly. And I always try to pose sometimes, when we're talking about this, is that, is a slower processing speed actually disadvantageous?
Right.
like we're in this culture right now that is asking us to actually slow down and create a pause for a more mindful, inclusive collective. And if we take that pause and we have kids that tend to take time to process things, that might actually be the better way to do things.
Right. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true, because we impose these standards on our kids. We say this test should take 2 hours or this test should take an hour. And why are we penalizing students who might need some more time to kind of think things through, to formulate their thoughts, to access their creativity and integrate those thought processes into the work that they produce? Yeah.
And I actually, in my book, I highlight this with one of the children where he was a highly gifted child finishing his GED. Well, he was a young man at that point, and he lacked a revision for his IEP, and therefore they didn't allow the extra time for his math. And he actually got a perfect score on the math, but he took extra time to do it, and was kind of held in limbo due to the fact that he needed to get a new assessment to prove he needed the extra time. And and it was actually quite a financial hardship on this family. And so I think that the other thing that we really miss is that not only are these children, perhaps otherized, by processing things in a slower way, or kind of penalized, missing recess with their buddies or different things like that. But at the same time, there's a significant financial burden parents face to keep their child where they can continually thrive. And I think we need to really reconsider our system. If somebody's getting 100% and needs 40 extra minutes, that doesn't, I don't see them as failing the test. And I think that there's a real big disconnect between time to process things. And we do know, for example, when people are in creative flow and they're engaged, their brain is using a lot more activity, which is going to cause a greater brain drain. So, I think we really, need to really think about what we're actually questioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can imagine for a child who is capable of getting 100% on a math test and who may have to stop that test when they've only completed 70% of the items on the test, how frustrating that would be. And the child who's sitting in the classroom and who's engaging his imagination and creativity and getting some nonverbal cues from his teacher that he's not or she's not doing what it is that she's supposed to be doing, and maybe not paying attention and not motivated and not working hard enough to stay engaged, that can really have an impact on their emotional well-being.
And yes, their emotional well-being and their mental health. Studies show that when children are kind of met with negative feedback in school, that it really leaves them with a greater risk of having low self-esteem issues, low kind of motivation issues. And it could really cause, actually, we know when you're getting constant negative feedback, that actually inhibits learning in itself. So if a child's constantly being told that they're not meeting the standards or they're not fitting within the box, that's going to even increase a greater detachment and demotivation. I think about the piece that you really make the point of the kid who needs that extra time on an exam that's missing it. When they're missing that extra time and they come back and they get a 40% when they could have really earned 100%, that could have devastating consequences for their life trajectory, because they may never feel that they could amount to anything.
Mm-hmm. And you can see that impact on self-concept, which we know is related to depression and anxiety. And some of the research that you described in your book talks about already gifted individuals have differences in the networks that are controlling emotional processing. And then it can be exacerbated by these nonverbal negative cues that they're getting from people around them, whether it be educators or their peers, even that they're not fitting into that box like you describe, or they're otherized.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that, what we do know too is that not only are the brains primed for kind of a greater level of emotional capacity and emotional processing, and at the same time, these kids describe from very young ages, from Dr. Webb and Linda Silverman, having these very high levels of emotional depth, kind of described as old souls, where even in fact, they may want to seek out very deep conversations. And if their teacher is missing them, if their parents tend to miss them, and if their peers or classmates tend to miss them, kind of seeing themselves reflected in society, they tend to, feel a little more isolated and alone if they're not given both verbal and nonverbal cues that they're being heard and seen for their abilities.
And so many just often describe themselves as just experiencing the world differently. And that can be very isolating as well, because what kinds of conversations are you able to have with your peers? The things that you might be interested in discussing may not be of interest to your same age peers because, again, of that asynchronous development. And then at the same time, educators might be looking at these children and say, that there are some difficulties with emotional regulation, and it can be confusing to many teachers and parents that you've got this highly gifted child who is able to process mathematical problems, or is an avid reader, but can't navigate social situations or can't manage their emotions when they're frustrated or disappointed. And that, again, that asynchronous development, when you're looking at cognitive versus emotional development, can be very confusing to parents and educators.
Yeah. And the truth is that emotional regulation and development, happens all throughout our lives. That really happens, it's part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's part of, the area of the brain that develops into our 30s and can be changed with mindfulness practices, for example. And at the same time, these children and even adults can really have challenges with their emotional communication because they weren't really taught the skills or the resources that what they're experiencing is valued or seen. And And absolutely, it can be confusing that you have a child who, can be doing college level calculus, and that same child, is screaming because there are sounds, or even they see somebody homeless on the street and it causes them a very deep sadness. I think the thing is that one thing we could do is really teach these children how to identify, so note their emotional states, which can better help communicate their processing about it. We know, for example, when we name something, and I like to say name it and embrace it with compassion, because we know when we at least can identify the experience, it helps. So often these children are kind of pushed aside that you're too sensitive, you need to get over it, move on, get a tougher skin. And we know that those techniques didn't work in our generation. And so we shouldn't be doing that to our kids. In fact, much of modern day meditative practices center on emotional regulation. That's the heart of what was so lacking in the system. And I think lacking sometimes in families, because you could have a series of very emotional individuals. And maybe the highest emotional outburst gets the attention.
Right.
And so I think that, understanding, helping children really work through it, I think is a valuable process. I also think the other piece, that, kids that can be otherized, we know, that are bullied and things like that, there are consequences that happen, to the neurobiology and the nervous system, where they tend to have, take on more anxiety, and can have more depression. And likewise, some of the kids who, are highly, highly gifted, and are getting that 40%, for example, can have that, anxiety and depression fall into sort of never feeling good enough. And so, I think that what we have to do is kind of really reshape our ways that we communicate with our kids, and positively guide them with their strengths, and bring in supports when they're struggling.
And I think that's just so important in terms of what you said about positively guiding them with their strengths and their passions, and then also providing that professional support when they need it, because we don't want to do is dismiss the depression or the anxiety and say they're just overly sensitive, when in fact they could benefit from some professional help and support. And then when we have kids who are experiencing these big emotions, which could be a stress response to overstimulation, we also want to make sure that we are not mislabeling them as having an ADHD when in fact it's a heightened sensitivity.
So, yeah, so beautifully said. I mean, I think the point that having that very highly primed nervous system for sensory processing and receptivity, can absolutely get misidentified for attentional issues as well as emotional dysregulation. Because at the core of it, a child is either distracted by a sensory stimuli that is painful and calling their attention, and they're also trying to navigate and communicate that it's causing them suffering. And I always try to point out to parents and even adults who are gifted and may not are learning about it themselves, is that, if your nervous system is primed where you're experiencing pain and suffering at the core, and we're responding with harshness and get yourself in check rather than investigating. Well, what's the matter? Are the sounds too loud? Yes. then we can introduce different things to calm and regulate that nervous system that feels overtaxed and overstimulated.
Right. And you need to understand in order to know how to support them, to know what it is that they need, to regulate that nervous system, to decrease that anxiety, to address self-concept issues or sadness, frustration, whatever that might be. But if you don't investigate, you won't understand the reaction that you're seeing or the behavior that you're witnessing.
So well put.
And you talk a lot about anxiety in your book, and you've mentioned it in this conversation. And anxiety is often related to perfectionism, and perfectionism has been described in individuals who are gifted. And in your book, you state that perfection pressure can lead to perfection paralysis. Can you tell the listeners what you mean by that? Because I thought that was just such an important piece that you highlighted.
Yeah. So often, I think one thing we do with these gifted kids is that when they are gifted, we kind of can perhaps overtax their gift without their consent. If you have a highly avid reader, that kid may really enjoy going to the library, but the pressure of telling other people about the book and regurgitating it may not be something they want to do. They may not want to be your little encyclopedia. And so often we want to put them into this idea of being the little professor, and they're not, performance pieces. They're human beings. And so what I talk about and sometimes we can overemphasize their gift. Well, it may not be something they want to totally explore either. But really, when I was talking about with perfection, perfection pressure leads to perfection paralysis, is that idea that their outcome, needs to be perfect. That, perfectionism can be broken down into two areas. The first area is the piece where it's related to your idea. So perfectly doing something. And the second piece is your concern with it. So how concerned are you with it being perfect? And when a child's concern is the main focus, it could cause them to go into that. We know the nervous system goes into fight, flight, freeze, and flop. And it could go into the freeze and flop mode where they're paralyzed and can't even get through the process because they're so overconsumed in their imagination with not meeting the concerns of themselves and others and related to being perfect. And it could be a cycle that you have to really work with a child through step by step.
And so what are some strategies that you would recommend to parents who might be seeing some of that perfectionism that is paralyzing for their children? What are some thoughts what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think the first thing is always investigate, identify what that origin is, worst case scenario, what's going to happen? Oh, I'm going to forget, say they're doing a play. I'm going to forget my lines on stage. Okay. And if that happens, what happened? What do you do?
Right.
What's your next step? I ask somebody what the line is. Okay. And then what do you do? And you kind of go through it. And then, a lot of what I try to encourage parents to do is often, anxiety is really imagination. It's fear of fear. So it's current fear, afraid of future fear, right? And so if we can engage the mind in a positive imagination versus a negative imagination, so address what is the fear first. And then the second thing is, well, how can we rewire that thinking? What would be the best case scenario? I would nail all my lines. Okay. So let's imagine that. And now let's practice together. And so, and I think the biggest thing too is the perfectionist paralysis is the aloneness. feeling alone. And the more that they can you can normalize the experience for the child. And you say, oh, I can understand that. I have that too. It destigmatizes it for the child.
And it just seems like that normalizing would decrease the pressure on them, would decrease the anxiety. And then talking through, again, when you talk about what could happen and then what would happen. And then it also helps them to realize that, well, I guess it wouldn't be that bad. And I'm worrying more than I should about this situation. And it also gives an opportunity for parents to problem solve with their children about what you could do, at a certain point. Like you said, you could ask someone for the line and it wouldn't be devastating. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also too, helping them investigate their emotions about it. I'm afraid. Okay. What are you afraid of? And where do you feel that fear in your body? And just kind of get them to recognize that it also, that stuckness doesn't have to last, that you can help them move through that stuckness with open mind and compassion. I think another piece of it is really compassionate dialogue and discourse where, as a parent and as a teacher, if you model compassion for their experience, they learn to internalize compassion for themselves.
Right. And, as you're talking, I'm imagining a child who's creative, imaginative, empathetic, highly motivated, has a sense of humor, gifts, talents, but yet struggles. Again, that 2E profile, struggles with reading or communicating or establishing friendships or focusing. And it seems like having that compassion can go such a long way. And that's kind of a starting place to help that child realize their full potential. Because again, they've got all of these gifts, all of these strengths, all of these passions. And yet that area of struggle, an area of weakness doesn't have to define them, but oftentimes it can feel overwhelming and there can be a hyper focus on that difficulty.
Yes. And I think bringing in the compassion where, this is the experience I'm in. In this moment, I'm feeling this. In this moment, I'm experiencing this. And I think another thing that I really like to point out too is that so often we identify our feelings as I am feeling rather than a feeling and is actually an experience you're having, right? So if you could help a child better identify this is an experience I'm having, not an experience I am, that could kind of really help shift that dialogue as well. And I think the other thing too is helping a child recognize that even in the areas where they're experiencing challenge, that in itself is a gift because they're having to develop workarounds and have that kind of be their superpower of how to uniquely process things. And maybe it's different and maybe their friends have an easier time reading, but at the same time, they're learning to read on their own terms and in their own timeline. And, there's a lot of supports like audiobooks and, different, reading therapies out there that can help a child.
You provided a lot of guidance and a lot of advice for parents. And, I'm thinking of a parent who's listening, who is raising a gifted child, or a teacher who has a gifted child, or a 2E kid in their classroom. You've given them a lot of valuable information in terms of how to support the development of that whole child, right? And how to support that child's experience. Anything else that you think would be helpful to parents or educators to know about providing support, appropriate level of support, and addressing the needs of a child who thinks differently, who experiences the world differently, and who may not fit into that neat box of a traditional academic setting?
Yeah, I love that question. And I love, it makes me think of the Maya Angelou quote that, if you're always trying to be normal, you never know how amazing you could be. And I just love that because I think it really resonates with the fact that, what makes you unique is your superpower, not fitting into that box. And so the more a child could feel empowered in their uniqueness, the more a child could feel well-versed in their communication and production styles and, have the ability to say, oh, I'm twice exceptional. I have ADHD. Could you say that again?
Mm-hmm.
I zoned out for a second. I was looking at the squirrel, and for people to say, oh yeah, no problem, where it's not that they feel like they have to keep up and be in a certain way, or can you say that again? Or can I look at this again? Or, it's going to take me a moment to process this. Give me a moment, where they can communicate how they uniquely experience and respond to the world and feel empowered.
Right. And at the same time as they're doing that, be accepted for who they are.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Your book, Insight into a Bright Mind, it's so informative. It's engaging, it's creative, it's comprehensive. It helps people understand giftedness, 2E, unique thinking, the gifted brain. You talk about everything from emotions like we've discussed here today, to the gut-brain connection, to positive life practices. It really is a must read. And I just want to thank you for writing it. And thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to always speak with you. And I love the work you're doing to help families and guide students, to be their best selves. And what you're doing is so important. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. So if listeners want to reach out to you and learn more about your work, where can they go?
Oh, they could go to my website, NicoleTetreault.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter at Awesome Neuro. So just email me, text, and I will get back to you as best I can.
Wonderful. And I will put all that information in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much again for being here today. It's just such an honor to be having this conversation with you.
Thanks for having me. It was an honor to be with you.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to get a copy of Dr. Tetreault's book, Insight into a Bright Mind. It is absolutely fantastic, and you will find a link in the show notes. There are also a host of other resources there as well, so be sure to check them out. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found this episode helpful. And if you did, would you leave a review? I'd really appreciate it. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.